Studying 2 Corinthians, a scholar, a fellow named Scott Hafeman, in his commentary on 2 Corinthians, he says, the letter we call 2 Corinthians is widely recognized as the most difficult to understand among Paul's letters. Now, Paul's got a lot of things that are difficult to understand. Whether you agree with that assessment or not about 2 Corinthians, the fact the letter is widely perceived that way lets you know that we're heading into deep water. And the journey, it may be difficult, but I hope the reward is worth it in the end. Now, like all of Paul's letters, 2 Corinthians is an occasional document, meaning it was written to a specific group of Christians in a specific situation or circumstance. And if one is to hear correctly what the Spirit is saying to the church today through 2 Corinthians, one first must hear correctly what the Spirit said through 2 Corinthians to the church in Corinth. Once we understand what the Spirit is saying to the church in Corinth, we then are in a position to understand what is the Spirit saying to us today through what He said to the church in Corinth. So it's important in that regard to have that perspective. And a significant part of that effort of hearing correctly what Paul is saying to the church in Corinth is gaining some understanding of the circumstances of the letter as best we can put things together that will aid us in hearing what the Spirit is saying to the church there. As I said in the introduction to 1 Corinthians, which we studied right before we did the series on archaeology in the Bible, it's easy to idealize churches in the apostolic era, to think that they were free from struggle and conflict and problems, and that ministry in those days, especially for the apostles, that it was a walk in the park because all were of one heart and mind. But the reality is that the church of every generation, including the first generation, is made up of flawed, sinful human beings who, though redeemed, continue to struggle with life as we await the Lord's return. That's how it is. We limp along being transformed into the image of Jesus. That was true for the church then, it's true for the church today, and you're aware of that from our study together. Now, just to remind you, Corinth, here's first the wide view, first century Mediterranean world, but the city of Corinth was located on one end of this narrow isthmus that connects the Peloponnese with the rest of Greece. And here's kind of a zeroing in on the center of this. And it was well positioned for that reason for trade and commerce. And the history of Corinth is really in two parts. You have the very famous, ancient, wealthy city of Corinth that was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. And it survived, but it survived in a much diminished form, with people essentially living in the ruins of Corinth. And that went on for a long time until the city was refounded by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. It was refounded as a Roman colony. So it's obviously a Greek city, was a famous Greek city, was wealthy, destroyed in 146, about a century later in 44 BC, refounded by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony. And the new city, it quickly became prosperous. It attracted many people. And the Romans, they officially dominated the city with their laws, their culture, and their religion. But not surprisingly, in the first century AD, there was a heavy influence of Greek culture. I mean, it's a Greek city that had been made a Roman colony and attracted many Romans to it. But you still had this influence of Greek culture. And there was also a substantial Jewish presence in the city of Corinth in the first century. The city was very religiously diverse. It not only had Roman and Greek religions, and there were a number of those, it had Judaism, and it also had various mystery cults from Egypt and Asia. The population of the city in Paul's day, estimates, people who do this kind of thing, the estimates are about 80,000, another 20,000 living in the areas right outside of the city. And it attracted large crowds of visitors every other year for the Isthmian Games. So that's the population. And in his commentary on 2 Corinthians, Hafemann, he gives the following summary that's based on a study of another scholar named Timothy Savage. He gives this summary of the Greco-Roman culture, what they stressed in terms of social status. I read this to you before, but I think it's helpful to have some feel for the culture and the people, what they valued and this kind of thing. And here's what Hafemann says. He says, in regard to sizing up one's peers, Savage, that's Timothy Savage, observes that in Paul's day, Greco-Roman society stressed rugged individualism that valued self-sufficiency, wealth as the key to status within society, a self-display of one's accomplishments and possessions in order to win praise from others, a competition for honor that viewed boasting as its natural corollary, and 5, a pride in one's neighborhood as a reflection of one's social location. These values combined to create a populace for which self-appreciation became the goal and self-gratification the reward. And the way they tended to view religion was, it viewed Greco-Roman culture, they viewed religion as a means of health, wealth, and social standing. In other words, it was my religion provided these things for me. They valued the religion according to how the deity of that religion was able to deliver those things for its adherents. So if you're belonging to this religion, your expectation or hope is that you're going to be provided these things of health, wealth, and social standing as a result of your adhering to this particular religion. It was a way to gain status and altitude. Hafemann, again, drawing on Savage's work, he says, the various religions attracted followers by providing visible displays of their gods at work, as seen in the success of their members. The more powerful one's God, the more strength one expected to receive and manifest. In the same way, on the popular level, orators gained a following not primarily by virtue of their content, but by their ability to captivate their audiences with powerful and entertaining deliveries. In Savage's words, they honored the one who preached with flair, force, and pride, and that was very relevant in 1 Corinthians. So you get this sense of their spirit and their attitude and their view toward religion. And all of these cultural trends, these things that as you try to identify the cultural markers of the Greco-Roman world, all of these things were magnified in Corinth, which in Ben Witherington's words, he says it became a magnet for the socially ambitious, for status-hungry people. Okay, just the flavor of it. Gordon Fee describes Corinth as the New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas of the ancient world. And to quote Hafemann again, he says, the self-made Roman freedmen who had applied the hard labor of their former slave status to the business of making it in this new Roman colony were known for being crassly materialistic, self-confident, and proud. The atmosphere of sports that filled the air with its pride, competition, and exaltation of heroes, not to mention that Corinth was the entertainment center of Greece, exacerbated all of this. So you can get a sense of why some of the things that they tended to see as negatives flow out of this kind of arrogant culture and view of things. Now, Greek and Roman culture, they valued rhetoric and oratorical skill, and that easily deteriorated into kind of a celebrity status, something like, we have Hollywood celebrities today. Now, the church in Corinth, predominantly Gentile, but it was quite diverse. It included Jews, Greeks, Romans, slaves, freedmen. And as Gordon Fee comments, he says the majority of them were almost certainly at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. So these aren't the people who would be viewed in that culture as they're big time. They've made it. They're successful. They were toward the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. And he says, as former pagans, they brought to the Christian faith a Hellenistic worldview and attitude toward ethical behaviors. Now, the occasion of the letter, I want to spend a bit of time on this. I'm sure you know most of this, but I always say I want to set what's going on in Paul's life, the circumstance that produces this letter, and I'm hoping that will give us some insight as we work our way through it. Well, Paul, he first preached the gospel in Corinth during his second missionary journey. You see that in Acts chapter 18. And he stayed there at that time with Priscilla and Aquila, that Jewish couple that had recently moved to Corinth from Rome. After the edict of Emperor Claudius, he expelled the Jews from Rome. You see that in Acts 18, but you also see that elsewhere in Roman literature, documenting that he did in fact do that. And one of the texts say he did so because of the rioting of the Jews at the instigation of Chrestus, is the word. And that's a misspelling of Christus, and it's clearly talking about the disturbance between Jews and Christians, Jewish Christians, and that caused him to just not make a distinction, just expel the Jews from Rome. That's when Priscilla and Aquila arrived in Corinth, and that's Paul. He stays with them, and while he stays with them there, he supports himself as a tent maker or a leather worker. And at some point, you'll recall that the Jews, they dragged Paul, while he's in Corinth, they dragged Paul before the proconsul Gallio, and they charged him with persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But Gallio was having none of it because he saw this as a religious dispute. So they're bringing Paul here and saying, hey, this guy's persuading people to worship God contrary to our law, and this Roman guy's going, hey, you guys just handle that yourselves. This is a religious dispute, not a matter of Roman law, and I'm not going to get involved in it. Paul remains in Corinth. We don't know exactly when he was taken before Gallio in terms of his stay, but after that he stays there quite a while. And Paul's total stay in Corinth during that first visit exceeded 1.5 years, as you see in Acts 18. And it was during that time that he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, so he had gone up, he'd been to Thessalonica, he plants a church, he's down here, he stays in Corinth a good while, and during his time there, that's when he writes those letters. And then after seeing the church established there, being there for more than 1.5 years, he then sails from Cenchrea, which is right next to Corinth, stopping off briefly in Ephesus. You see, so he goes here, he sails from Cenchrea, he sails over here to Ephesus. He stops off briefly there. And that's where he drops off Priscilla and Aquila. So Priscilla and Aquila, who were in Corinth, having come from Rome, Paul goes there. They join him on his way back. He leaves them there at Ephesus. And he then goes on and he goes down to Caesarea. And he then greets the church in Jerusalem. And then he returns to Antioch. So that's Paul's second missionary journey. This is probably in late 51 or early 52. I say there's wiggle room. It's hard to be exactly certain about these things or that precise. But this is close, and this is, I think, the most reasonable estimate. Paul spends a short time in his home congregation there in Antioch. And then he heads out again on his third missionary journey. And this is you see in Acts 18, 22. This is now probably AD 52. Okay, Paul's heading out on his third journey. He arrives back on his third journey. So he takes off again from Syrian Antioch. And he's going to wind up going right back here to Ephesus. Remember, he sailed from here, Ephesus, down here, drops off Priscilla and Aquila. Now his third journey comes back here to Ephesus. He arrives there, as I say, probably in the summer or the fall of 52. And he has a really fruitful ministry in Ephesus. He's there for over 2.5 years, so until the summer or fall of 55. So he's there quite a while. And sometime after Paul had left Priscilla and Aquila and his return, during that window, roughly a year, when he was there. That's when Apollos came to Ephesus knowing only the baptism of John. And that was during that interim that Priscilla and Aquila instructed him in the way of God more fully or more accurately. And Apollos then went to Corinth with letters of recommendation from the brothers there in Ephesus. You see that in Acts 18:24 to 19:1. And during Paul's absence from Corinth, Apollos and a number of others built on the foundation that Paul had laid there. He planted the church, was there for over a year and a half. He leaves. Apollos and others in his absence go there and build on that. Now, while he's at Ephesus, he learned of certain problems in the church in Corinth, and he wrote them a letter. In that letter in which he forbid them from associating with immoral people. Now, we don't have that letter. But we know about that letter because Paul refers to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. And he clearly there in the letter, when he tells them to avoid associating with immoral people in that letter, he was speaking in the context of church discipline. But you had people in Corinth who wound up interpreting his words in a very general sense, and that's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, I didn't mean people of the world. Because then you'd have to jump out of the world if you're going to avoid immoral people. He says, I'm talking about the church. And he goes on and explains that. Then afterward, after he gets that, he sends that letter there where he says, don't associate with immoral people. That's the first letter. We don't have that letter. I always say that we don't have it. It's not when people say it's lost, it's so as God intended us to have it and he wasn't able to accomplish that. Not at all. We don't have that letter because God didn't think we needed that letter. Okay, but we know of the letter from Paul's reference to it. And afterward, Paul receives reports and a letter from the church which prompts him to write 1 Corinthians, the letter that we studied last year. That prompts him to write that, and he writes 1 Corinthians in AD 54. So that's a good date for that. Now we see in 1 Corinthians that some of the spiritually immature believers there in Corinth, they had formed partisan groupings, and they claimed to follow this or that leader. We saw that the church there was marred by abuses of the Lord's table. It was marred by sexual immorality, by lawsuits, by uncertainties about the place of marriage and the propriety of eating food that was sacrificed to idols. They had a warped view of the spiritual gifts. They had a spiritualized view of the resurrection. And segments of the church in Corinth, they were disenchanted with Paul and they were resistant to his leadership. And that's going to continue. So I say, you think that ministry in the first century was a walk in the park. I look at Paul. I say, I can just see Paul's heart just going, oh. And as we'll see, he writes them, he does. He talks about writing them with tears, I'll mention in a minute. Now, when Paul sent 1 Corinthians, okay, there's a reason I'm telling you this. It factors into 2 Corinthians. When he sent 1 Corinthians, it was his intention to remain in Ephesus until after Pentecost, which is in late May, and that's probably late May of 55. That was his intent there. And then he was going to visit Corinth by way of Macedonia, which would put him there sometime in the winter. So he's planning, he's here in Ephesus. When he writes 1 Corinthians, his intention is to visit them this way, going up through Macedonia and coming down and seeing them there. Now, when he formulated those plans, he didn't have any great urgency. He wasn't looking to bolt. He didn't have great urgency to visit Corinth. After all, he was in no hurry to leave because a great door for effective work, as he says in 1 Corinthians 16:9, that was still open there. But after he sends 1 Corinthians in 54, Paul decides that it would be better to visit Corinth twice. Instead of going and visiting them once through Macedonia and coming down, I'll visit them on the way to Macedonia and from Macedonia. So he decides then it would be better to visit them twice. And he then learned, perhaps when Timothy returned. If you remember from 1 Corinthians, Paul had sent Timothy. And perhaps when Timothy returned, but whenever, he learned that there was a condition in the church that had become critical. Some kind of crisis had developed in the church, due in part to the arrival of what I will call Judaizing intruders. Okay? Due in part to their arrival from Judea, and they presented themselves, these interlopers or these intruders, they presented themselves to the church in Corinth as leaders. And the identity and nature of these recently arrived opponents, this is a subject of much debate. Okay, so I alert you to that. I'm telling you how I see it and what I think. It seems that they were Greek-speaking Jews from Judea who recognized Jesus to be the Christ, but who had some kind of Judaizing agenda. Okay, some kind of Judaizing agenda, meaning they urged or insisted that Gentile Christians adopt certain aspects of Judaism. But their approach, it seems to have differed from the Judaizers Paul deals with in Galatia. Because Paul in 2 Corinthians doesn't mention circumcision. And you remember that was significant in what he says in Galatia. So they're Judaizers, but how they're different, whether it's simply they're in an earlier stage or whether they have a different approach in trying to pull the Gentiles over to coming under the Mosaic law. So they have a Judaizing purpose or agenda, but there seems to be some distinction either at the stage or in their tactics or in their approach, so that Paul isn't talking about circumcision here. And as Judaizers of some kind, some stripe, they would have naturally been motivated to undermine Paul's authority because Paul is an opponent of Judaizers. Because Paul knows that the Gentiles are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, and you have no right to try to pull them under the Mosaic law. So they would know that Paul is opposed to that, so they would have an incentive, a motivation to try to diss him among the Corinthians, and then there are already some people who are resistant to Paul's authority. So they would be natural allies. Here's how Hafemann speaks of this group. He says, from their perspective, these opponents, being a member of the new covenant and a Jew was the key to experiencing the full spiritual blessing that God has for his people. This meant that for the members to become full-fledged members of God's people, they had to trust in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and become part of God's chosen people, Israel, in accordance with the Sinai covenant. Only then could they expect to experience God's covenant promises completely. Okay? So they may be nuancing this somehow, but still they're pulling the people and saying, listen, you need to become a Jew in some way, shape, or form. Murray Harris, he sees an alliance between two groups of opponents. He says in his commentary, our overall conclusion is this. Paul's opponents were probably Jews from Judea, perhaps Jerusalem, who came to Corinth as self-appointed agents of a Judaizing program. They claimed to be Christian, illegitimately invoked the authority of the 12, and found common cause with a group of Corinthian proto-Gnostics in their attempt to undermine Paul and his apostolic work. Now, because of this serious situation that he hears about that develops there in Corinth, Paul makes an emergency visit to Corinth. He'd been there once before. This emergency visit is going to be his second visit. He will say in Corinth, I'm getting ready to come to you a third time. Well, you say, well, what's the second time? This is the second time. It is this emergency visit that he makes, and though he seems to have spared the rod that he mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 21, this emergency visit that he makes because of this crisis situation in Corinth, it was painful for both the Corinthians and for Paul. And you can see that in 2 Corinthians 2, 1-3. For whatever reason, Paul found it necessary to leave the situation in Corinth that he'd gone there, this situation, that emergency situation. He found it necessary to leave it unresolved and return to Ephesus. You say, why would he do that? Well, I don't know. I can think of many reasons. He's there and they're just colliding, nothing's happening, and Paul has responsibilities back in Ephesus. But he goes there, has this painful visit. He returns to Ephesus with that being unresolved, and at some point, one of Paul's opponents there in Corinth defied Paul openly and attacked him in personal and deeply insulting ways. And you'll see this in 2 Corinthians 2, 5-8, 10, 7, 12. And apparently the church in Corinth was down with that. They tolerated this person's savage attack on Paul. And they went along with it. They tolerated it. Now, many people think that this attack occurred during Paul's emergency visit there. But I think Murray Harris is probably right in thinking that Paul heard about it soon after he left Corinth from that emergency visit, returning to Ephesus. Then he soon hears about this attack that had been made on him and that had been tolerated. And in keeping with his new plans, right? You remember when he wrote 1 Corinthians, I was going to visit you through Macedonia. Then he thinks, no, I'll go there, visit you on the way to and from. So in keeping with those plans, Paul presumably told the Corinthians during that emergency visit, hey, I'm now planning to come to you again on the way to and from Macedonia. But the emergency visit that he had, that turned out to be so distressing and so difficult and so unproductive, only to be followed by this verbal assault on him that was reported to him and that they had tolerated. So then Paul decides, well, I think I need more time from another visit. And he reverts to the original itinerary where I will see you coming through Macedonia. In other words, I'm not now going to see you on the way to and from Macedonia because of how difficult that visit had been. So after returning to Ephesus, being informed of that personal attack, Paul then sends Titus to Corinth with what is known as the severe or the tearful letter. He sends him with that, and that's referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. And that's a letter that Paul wrote out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears. And you can imagine, all that Paul's doing, trying to bless people's lives, and he's being treated this way by the people he would die for. And so you see the tears and just all of the distress that Paul, so I say, you think ministry was easy then? Just read this. So Paul assures the Corinthians of his love for them in this tearful letter, but he also laid down the standards that he expected in the churches. He laid down the standards and he sought to determine if they would meet those standards. And you see that in chapter 2, verse 9 of 2 Corinthians. And he also demanded punishment of that person who had opposed him so maliciously. He demanded punishment of that person. And this letter, this severe letter or tearful letter, it has not been preserved. Okay, so the first letter that he wrote is not preserved. The third letter that he wrote is not preserved. But what we have is 1 and 2 Corinthians. Now Titus, he's there after that emergency visit. He's delivering this severe or tearful letter, and he presumably let it be known while he was there that he had plans to meet Paul in Troas or in Macedonia with news of their response, right? So he's saying, listen, he's over here. He lets it be known, I'm going to meet Paul in Troas or in Macedonia with news of how you have responded to this severe letter. And so when he tells them that, they then realize that Paul has now changed his plan. He had told them first, 1 Corinthians, I'm coming this way. Then he tells them, no, I'm coming this way. Up and back. Well, now they learn from Titus, who has the severe letter, that, oh no, he's going to go up here again. And so you see, it makes them think, it opens him up to the charge that he's fickle. You see that he's fickle, he's untrustworthy, he's indifferent to the feelings of the church. And that's why Paul explains the change of plans in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 2. If you wonder, what's this about? Why does he feel the need to go ahead and explain his change of plans? It is because they were using his change of plans to undermine him, to say that he really wasn't, like I said, he was fickle. He's not trustworthy. Can't go with this guy. Now, Titus also had the responsibility, depending on how the Corinthians responded to that severe letter that Titus was taking, he had the responsibility to organize the collection for Jerusalem, to which the Corinthians, they initially had been willing to contribute. So Paul then sends this severe letter, and the thing is look, if they receive this well, then go ahead and organize the contribution that they've already said they were down with. And their participation in that contribution would not only bless the poor saints in Jerusalem, but it would signal, you see, their fellowship with Paul and with the apostolic church. Because this is serious business. Are you going to be part of us or not? Are you going to strike out on your own trail, which leaves the apostolic church? And so that's what's at stake. And then shortly after the riot in Ephesus that's recorded in Acts 19:23 through 21, Paul left Ephesus for Troas. You see, he mentions that in 2 Corinthians 2:12 and 13, where he hoped not only to preach the gospel, but he hopes then to meet Titus, who's returning with news of Corinth. And so when Titus doesn't show in Troas, Paul goes on to Macedonia. Apparently they had a contingency plan. So the idea is like, listen, we didn't have cell phones and stuff. So we make these plans, say, I'm going to be here, and if you can't get here by then, well then stick here and I'll get here. Okay, so apparently he goes to Troas. He's not in Troas. He then goes into Macedonia in keeping with that plan. And in Macedonia, Paul encourages the Christians, you see in Acts 21 and 2, and he organizes the collection for the Jerusalem believers while he's there in Jerusalem, you see in 2 Corinthians 8, 1-4, 9, 2. And the Macedonian churches were themselves facing the most severe trial. They were facing extreme poverty. And yet here they are organized to contribute to the poor saints in Jerusalem. When Paul got there, Titus hadn't shown up. So Paul has no idea. And it's really hard on him, because he knows how serious this situation is, and he's dying to hear, how did they respond to this letter? But he goes to Macedonia. Titus not there yet. And so it's really difficult. And then Titus soon arrived, and Paul's distress, it turns to joy. Because the church there in Corinth at large had responded positively to his words, as you see in chapter 7, 6-13. It's like, oh man. You see, they okay, we're with you. We're with you. We're not going off on this direction. Now, the majority of who had resisted had repented of their rebellion against Paul's apostleship, but there was still a segment. There was still a pocket and group that continued to resist Paul's authority and the gospel. And 2 Corinthians is shaped by the presence of both of those groups. Okay? The people who were there, who had been on board, the people who had drifted and who had repented in response to Paul's letter, and these people who still aren't on board and are resisting. And here is the sequence of the letters. You get the previous letter referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:11. You get 1 Corinthians AD 54. He have the emergency visit. He comes back to Ephesus. He writes the severe or the tearful letter that Titus takes there. And then you get 2 Corinthians, when he receives the news from Titus how they had responded to his severe letter. So that's kind of the background of what's going on when Paul writes this letter. Now, many scholars have through the years argued that 2 Corinthians is a composite of two or more letters that some unknown editor stitched together into one letter. Now, there are serious problems with that claim. Okay, the first of which is that there is no manuscript support for it. You have no manuscripts of a portion of 2 Corinthians circulating independently, and you have no manuscripts of these things missing from 2 Corinthians. So that would be one thing that is significant about that. The other would be what would motivate a Christian editor to stitch into a letter another letter and then pass it off it just seems odd. And those kinds of problems are what lead, as Moyer Hubbard says in his 2017 commentary, he says, that's why recent scholarship has increasingly supported the unity of 2 Corinthians. So there have been many people who made these arguments. I think it's losing the day, and increasingly scholars are recognizing the better case is that 2 Corinthians is a unit. It is one letter. Now there are some difficult transitions in it, and that's what leads people to say, man, this is hard to understand. And one of them, perhaps the biggest one, is chapters 10 to 13, is how do you understand the change in tone between chapter 9 and 10? Because Paul receives this news from Titus, and he's really happy, joyful. You get to chapter 10, and a page has turned. You know, there's a clear change in tone between 9 and 10. And I think the best way to understand it, I'll say this more when we get there, but Paul probably started writing, these things, you picture him sitting down at a desk or something. He's using undoubtedly an amanuensis, but he's sitting down, okay, just all in one shot. Not necessarily. See, Paul can go on and have time and talk and dictate and say something, and then this can be a process. And I think Paul started 2 Corinthians when he received the great news from Titus of how they had responded to his severe letter. But his tone then changes because after chapter 9, he received news of some kind of counteroffensive. Some kind of counteroffensive launched against him by the Judaizing element there in Corinth. So then when we get to chapter 10, he's learned of this, and now he's much bolder and stronger there in chapters 10 through 13. And he doesn't mention that, hey, I received some new information, that's why I'm changing my tone. But the people in Corinth would have known why he was changing his tone because of the things he identifies in 10 to 13. They would have known that. He didn't have to say to them, hey, I heard of this, because it would be obvious from the things he's saying in 10 to 13 that he was reacting to this counteroffensive. Okay, that's how I think is the best way to understand it. What are the purposes of 2 Corinthians? Here's how Andreas Kostenberger, Scott Kellum, and Charles Quarles, in their book, The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown, an Introduction to the New Testament, here's what they say about the purpose of it. It says, Paul's change of travel plans made him vulnerable to the charge he was unreliable and unworthy of trust. He needed to defend his reliability and explain the reasons for his change of plans. Now, isn't that just perfect? If you have people who don't like you, who are hostile towards you, they will use anything to try to dirty you. And so Paul has noble reasons for everything he's doing. He acts this way, but you have people here, yeah, you can't trust this guy. What's he, out of his mind? I think I'll do this. I think I'll do that. You see how that works. He says, they say, he wrote to encourage the Corinthians to restore the man they had disciplined for verbally attacking him. That's that person that savaged Paul. And Paul said, and more's at stake here. You see, Paul's not doing this. He doesn't tell them to do this for his ego. He tells them to do this because it's important that his apostleship be honored. You see, because he is an emissary of God. And if you throw him out, you're throwing out the Word of God. And you're throwing out God's man. And so there are tremendous ramifications that will harm you. It's not simply a matter of ego. It has far-reaching consequences. He says, 3, he wrote to clarify the nature of his apostolic ministry and his qualifications for that ministry. 4, he wrote to encourage them to fulfill their pledge to contribute to the offering for the saints in Jerusalem. Now, Hafeman says, in terms of the purpose of 2 Corinthians, he says in 2 Corinthians, Paul both comforts and encourages the majority of the church, while at the same time defending his apostleship in order to strengthen those who have repented and to win back the recalcitrant minority. Moreover, behind the Corinthians lurk Paul's opponents, whom Paul does not address directly, but who are the most direct source of the problem. Paul's goal in writing, therefore, is to prepare for his next visit to the Corinthians, in which he will have to judge those who persist in their rejection of him and his gospel. See, to reject him is to reject the gospel. That's why it's so difficult. And then here is what Kostenberger, Kellum, and Quarles say about the purpose of chapters 10 through 13, where we have that shift in tone. He says, Paul's defense of his apostolic authority becomes much more intense in chapters 10 to 13. Paul was no longer confident that the Corinthians would recognize the false apostles for what they were, or that they would reaffirm his own apostolic authority. Paul wrote these chapters to urge the Corinthians to reject the false apostles and their message and to embrace again the gospel that Paul had preached. Paul also wrote to announce his plans to make a third visit to Corinth. Finally, he wrote to urge the Corinthians to examine their faith to determine whether it was authentic. So this is what I think all sets the stage. Okay? Now, with 3 minutes to go, we're going to look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. You know how I roll. We'll see. I'll talk till the bell rings. He opens up. Okay, so now I hope that's given you something of all the turmoil, all that Paul's been through, setting the stage for what he's writing to them. And he says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus through the will of God, and Timothy, the brother, to the church of God that is in Corinth, along with all the saints who are in Achaia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So Paul is an apostle of Christ by the will of God. Okay, he was chosen to be God's instrument in spreading the gospel. He's not any Tom, Dick, and Harry. He's an apostle, chosen by God to be his emissary in spreading the gospel, particularly to Gentiles. And his authority, it derived from the Lord himself. Right? He's just not a guy out there swinging at it. He is an apostle. And that's why opposing him is so serious. It's not like opposing me. Right? It's not like opposing any of you. That's just us wrestling and trying to understand. He is an apostle. And if you give him the boot, you're booting a lot more than just a person. And Timothy joins Paul in sending the letter, not in writing it. He's in accord with what Paul has written. And Timothy is very familiar. The Corinthians are very familiar with him. He's one of Paul's trusted co-workers, well known to the Corinthians. So here, and Timothy the brother. Okay, so I'm not here. I'm not odd man out. I'm not, strange. We're together. This is how we understand and see things and what God is saying to you. Paul, he doesn't write to the church of Corinth, but he writes to the church of God in Corinth. You see, the congregations, right? We are local expressions of the universal church of God, the church that belongs to God worldwide. And we are just local expressions of that universal church. So it's the church of God, the Corinthian manifestation of the church of God. And implicit in the fact the church belongs to God is that it should listen to the one who has been chosen to be the messenger of God. Whose church is it? It's God's. Who's the messenger of God? Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. So you need to listen to me, again, not for ego. This is for your own good. I'm trying to bless you. It's like sometimes you feel with your children. I'm not trying to mess with you. I'm trying to help you. And that's what's happening here. I heard that bell. Next week, Lord willing.